The early morning mist of September 27, 1944, clung to the ancient stones of Metz like a shroud, but nothing could hide the ominous silhouettes of the German fortifications that had turned this French city into an impregnable fortress. Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson crouched behind a shattered stone wall, his weathered hands gripping binoculars as he studied the massive concrete bastions ahead. What he saw made his blood run cold. Fort Bryant loomed before them like a medieval castle from hell itself, its thick concrete walls and interlocking fields of fire, representing everything that had gone wrong with General George Smith, Patton Jr.'s rapid advance across France. The Third Army, which had swept through the French countryside like wildfire, now found itself staring at the most formidable defensive position they had encountered since the beaches of Normandy. The fortress complex of Metz, with its interconnected forts, underground tunnels, and carefully positioned artillery, stood as Hitler's defiant answer to the Allied advance toward the German homeland. Peterson's radio crackled to life with the voice of Major General Walton Harris Walker, commanding officer of the 20th Corps. All units, this is Walker. Intelligence reports indicate the enemy has reinforced Metz with elements of the 17th Panzer Grenadier Division. Gentlemen, we're about to find out what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The fortress city of Metz had been a thorn in the side of armies for centuries, but never had it been as deadly as it was in 1944. The Germans had spent for years improving upon the already formidable French Maginot Line fortifications, adding their own engineering expertise to create a defensive network that military historians would later call one of the most challenging urban warfare environments of the entire war. According to recent analysis from the Army University Press, the battle would prove to be a critical test of American tactics and resolve, forcing innovations in urban warfare that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The 5th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Red Diamond, had been tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of cracking this nut. Colonel Robert Bell, 39th Infantry Regiment, had studied every available photograph and map of the German positions, but nothing had prepared his men for the reality of what lay before them. Concrete walls 8 feet thick absorbed direct hits from 155mm howitzers without so much as cracking. Machine gun nests, positioned with mathematical precision, created overlapping kill zones that turned every street into a potential grave. Sergeant First Class Michael O'Malley of the 2nd Battalion watched through his rifle scope as German soldiers moved with practiced efficiency between the fortress positions. These weren't the demoralized defenders he had expected, but elite troop who knew every stone, every angle, every killing field in their fortress domain. The Irish-American non-commissioned officer had fought through Sicily, Normandy, and the hedgerows of France, but something about Metz felt different. This wasn't just another objective to capture and move beyond. This was where the war would test whether American determination could overcome German engineering and fanaticism. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, but revealing the full extent of the challenge ahead. Metz wasn't just a city to be liberated, it was a fortress to be conquered, and every man in the 5th Infantry Division knew that the easy victories of the summer campaign were over. The real test of their mettle was about to begin, and history would judge whether American soldiers could break through defenses that had been for years in the making. October 12, 1944, dawn gray and rain-soaked, matching the mood of the American troops as they prepared for their first major assault on Fort Bryant. The weather had been abysmal for weeks, turning the approaches to Metz into a muddy quagmire that favored the defenders and made every movement a struggle against both enemy fire and the elements. Captain Robert Morrison of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 11th Infantry Regiment, peered through the driving rain at the imposing concrete mass that dominated the southwestern approaches to the city. The preparatory bombardment had begun at 0 for 100 hours, with more than 1,200 B-17 flying fortresses, a B-24 Liberators pounding the fortress ring around Metz in what would be remembered as one of the most concentrated bombing efforts of the European campaign. The thunder of falling ordnance was deafening, shaking the ground beneath the infantry positions and sending columns of smoke and debris skyward. Yet when the bombers departed and the smoke cleared, Fort Bryant stood unchanged, its massive concrete walls having absorbed the punishment like a stone accepting raindrops. Lieutenant William Hayes, a young officer from Ohio leading the 3rd Platoon, felt his stomach tighten as he watched the fortress emerge from the bombardment unscathed. His men, most of whom had never seen combat before joining the 5th Infantry Division, looked to him for reassurance he didn't feel. The propaganda back home had told them that American air power and artillery could flatten any obstacle. But the reality of German fortress engineering was proving far more resilient than anyone had anticipated. The assault began at 0630 hours with companies Easy and Fox advancing across the open ground toward Fort Dryant's outer defensive positions. The German response was immediate and devastating. Machine gun fire from carefully concealed positions raked the advancing infantry, while mortar rounds began falling with lethal precision among the attacking companies. Sergeant O'Malley, leading his squad in a desperate dash between shell craters, watched in horror as the soldier next to him simply disappeared in a burst of red mist when an 88mm shell exploded directly overhead. Colonel Ewell, commanding the 11th Infantry Regiment, had positioned himself in an observation post barely 800 yards from Fort Dryant's main entrance, close enough to see the individual muzzle flashes of German weapons as they cut down his advancing soldiers. The Germans had turned the approaches to the fort into carefully orchestrated killing fields, with every rock, every fold in the ground, every possible route of advance covered by interlocking fields of fire. As documented in the Army University Press military analysis, the German defenders of Fort Dryant represented some of the finest fortress troops in the Wehrmacht. These weren't the same soldiers who had been retreating across France throughout the summer, but specialized units trained specifically in fortress warfare, many of whom had gained experience in the siege warfare of the Eastern Front. They knew their positions intimately, having spent months preparing for exactly this kind of assault, and they fought with the desperation of men who understood that every yard given up brought the Allies closer to the German homeland. By noon, both assault companies had been reduced to less than half strength, with most of their officers either dead or wounded. The survivors huddled in whatever cover they could find, pinned down by accurate sniper fire and unable to advance or retreat safely. Captain Morrison, his radio operator dead beside him, watched through his binoculars as German engineers methodically detonated charges that sealed off tunnel entrances and collapsed sections of the outer defensive works, making it clear that they intended to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground. The first day's assault on Fort Dryant had been a costly lesson in the realities of fortress warfare, but it would prove to be only the beginning of what would become one of the bloodiest urban battles in American military history. The tunnels beneath Fort Dryant became a subterranean nightmare for the soldiers of the 11th Infantry Regiment as they fought their way into the fortress complex during the second week of October 1944. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson led his depleted squad through passages that reeked of curdite, blood, and human fear, their flashlights casting dancing shadows on concrete walls that seemed to close in with every step. The Germans had turned the underground maze into a death trap, with every corner potentially hiding a machine gun nest or a booby trap, designed to kill unwary American soldiers. The breakthrough had come at terrible cost. After 5 days of futile frontal attacks, combat engineers from the 23rd Engineer Battalion had finally managed to blast a hole in Fort Dryant's outer wall using a massive charge of TNT placed by volunteers who crawled through withering enemy fire to reach their objective. 2 of the 3 engineers who placed the charge never made it back to American lines, their sacrifice commemorated only by the gaping wound in the concrete that finally allowed American infantry to penetrate the fortress. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson found himself commanding what remained of 2 full companies as they fought their way through the fort's interior chambers room by room. The close-quarters combat was unlike anything these men had experienced in their advance across France. In the cramped confines of the fortress, rifles were often useless, and soldiers fought with bayonets, grenades, and whatever improvised weapons they could find. The echo of gunfire in the concrete corridors was deafening, and more than one American soldier suffered permanent hearing damage from the prolonged combat in enclosed spaces. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez from Texas discovered the true meaning of terror when his squad rounded a corner to find themselves face to face with 3 German soldiers, armed with Schmeisser submachine guns. The firefight lasted less than 10 seconds, but when the smoke cleared, Rodriguez was the only American still standing. His hands shook uncontrollably as he checked his fallen comrades for signs of life, finding none. The psychological toll of fortress combat was proving as devastating as the physical casualties. The German defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation and tactical superiority. Major Hauptkruger, commanding the fortress garrison, had positioned his men to take maximum advantage of the fort's design. Every room became a potential strongpoint, every hallway a killing field. When American soldiers finally cleared a section of the fort, German counterattacks from connecting tunnels would often retake the same positions within hours. forcing the Americans to fight for the same ground multiple times. According to historical analysis from the Warfare History Network, the battle for Fort Bryant represented a unique challenge in military engineering and tactics. The fortress had been designed by French military architects to withstand siege warfare, then improved by German engineers who understood exactly what kind of attack the Americans would mount. The result was a defensive position that seemed almost impregnable, requiring innovations in American tactics that would influence urban warfare doctrine for decades to come. Medical Corpsman Timothy Walsh moved through the captured sections of the fort like an angel of mercy, treating wounded soldiers under conditions that would have challenged hospital surgeons. Working by flashlight in blood-soaked concrete chambers, Walsh performed medical miracles that saved dozens of lives, crawling through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers, and somehow managing to evacuate the most seriously injured back to American lines. His actions during the battle would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross, though he would never speak publicly about what he witnessed in those underground chambers. By October 17th, elements of the 11th Infantry Regiment controlled approximately 30% of Fort Bryant's interior, but the cost had been appalling. The companies had been reduced to platoon strength, and ammunition was running critically low. The fortress that military planners had expected to fall into days had become a week-long nightmare that showed no signs of ending, and every American soldier involved in the assault understood that they were fighting one of the most difficult battles of the entire European campaign. The morning of October 23, 1944, brought no relief to the exhausted soldiers still fighting inside Fort Bryant's hellish interior. Major General Walker's decision to reinforce the assault with elements of the 90th Infantry Division had injected fresh troops into the battle, but even these reinforcements were quickly ground down by the relentless fortress combat. Captain James Bradley, recently arrived from the States with a company of replacement troops, found himself commanding men who had aged years in mere days. As they learned the brutal realities of fighting in concrete and steel, the German defenders had begun using a new tactic that chilled American soldiers to the bone. Rather than simply defending their positions, German engineers were systematically destroying sections of the fortress as they were forced to retreat, collapsing tunnels and sealing chambers to deny them to the advancing Americans. Demolition charges detonated throughout the fortress complex, sending shock waves through the concrete structure and sometimes burying American soldiers alive in the rubble of their hard-won victories. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson had been forced to establish his command post in what had once been a German ammunition storage chamber, surrounded by empty shell casings and the personal effects of enemy soldiers who had fought to the death rather than surrender. The captured German maps and documents revealed the true extent of the fortress network around Metz, showing interconnected defensive positions that would require months of similar battles to overcome completely. The psychological impact of fortress warfare was becoming as significant as the physical casualties. Soldiers who had performed heroically during the rapid advance across France found themselves breaking under the strain of prolonged underground combat. Combat fatigue cases increased dramatically, and medical officers reported symptoms they had never encountered before. Soldiers who refused to enter enclosed spaces, men who jumped at every sound, others who simply stared into space with vacant expressions that spoke of horrors beyond description. First Sergeant William Murphy, a veteran of the First World War who had thought he had seen everything warfare could offer, found himself counseling soldiers barely old enough to shave, who had witnessed things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The close-quarters nature of fortress combat meant that every casualty was personal, every death witnessed by men who had to continue fighting in the same blood-stained chambers where their friends had died. As recorded in contemporary military reports, the Battle of Fort Bryant had become a strategic nightmare for General Patton's Third Army. What was supposed to be a brief obstacle on the road to Germany had consumed an entire infantry regiment and shown no signs of yielding to conventional assault tactics. Supply lines stretched back through miles of muddy French countryside struggled to keep ammunition and medical supplies flowing to the battle, while casualty evacuation routes became clogged with the wounded and dying. The breakthrough finally came from an unexpected source. Captain Morrison, whose company had been reduced to just 27 effective soldiers, discovered that German demolition charges had actually opened new passages through the fortress interior. By following these unintended routes, American soldiers could bypass some of the strongest German defensive positions and attack from directions the defenders had not anticipated. The final assault on Fort Bryant's Central Command bunker began at dawn on October 24th. with the surviving soldiers of 3 different companies converging on the German command post. From multiple directions simultaneously, the fighting was savage and brief, ending when a German officer emerged from the command bunker carrying a white flag improvised from a torn uniform shirt. The fortress that had cost so many American lives had finally fallen, but the victory felt hollow to men who had paid such a terrible price for a single objective. In what would prove to be a much larger and more costly campaign, November 8, 1944, marked the beginning of the broader assault on Metz itself, as General Patton's Third Army committed 3 full divisions to reducing the entire fortress complex that surrounded the ancient city. The fall of Fort Bryant had been only the first step in what military planners now understood would be a prolonged urban warfare campaign requiring fundamentally different tactics. From the mobile warfare that had characterized the summer advance across France, the 10th Armored Division, commanded by Major General William Morris, Jr., found their Sherman tanks largely useless against the interlocking fortress positions that controlled every approach to Metz. Tank crews accustomed to rapid advances and fluid battlefield conditions discovered that fortress warfare reduced their expensive machines to expensive targets, vulnerable to German Panzerfaust and anti-tank guns positioned in carefully prepared positions. Staff Sergeant Robert Williams watched in horror as 3 tanks from his platoon were destroyed in the span of 5 minutes by German anti-tank teams that appeared, fired, and disappeared into the fortress network before American forces could respond. The 95th Infantry Division, newly arrived from training in the United States, received their baptism of fire in the approaches to Fort Jeanne d'Arc, another of the major fortress positions, controlling access to Metz proper. These fresh soldiers, many of whom had never been in combat, found themselves thrust immediately into some of the most challenging fighting conditions of the entire European campaign. Private Thomas Anderson from Minnesota wrote in a letter home that would be censored by military authorities, "This isn't like the war movies. The enemy doesn't run when we attack. They fight for every room, every hallway, every inch of ground like it's the most important place on earth." The German defenders of Metz were commanded by Lieutenant General Heinrich Kittel, a veteran of fortress warfare from the Eastern Front, who understood exactly how to maximize the defensive advantages of the position. Kittel had positioned his forces to take advantage of every natural and artificial obstacle, creating a defensive network that forced American attackers to expose themselves repeatedly while advancing through predetermined killing zones. His tactical innovation of using mobile reserves to counterattack recently captured positions meant that American forces often had to fight for the same objectives multiple times. Weather conditions in November made the tactical situation even more challenging for the attacking forces. Constant rain turned the approaches to Metz into muddy quagmires that channeled attacking forces into predictable routes covered by German fire. Supply trucks became bogged down in mud that was sometimes waist deep, forcing soldiers to carry ammunition and medical supplies forward by hand over distances that would have exhausted pack animals. According to analysis published in the Army University Press Historical Review, the Battle of Metz represented a crucial learning experience for American military doctrine, forcing adaptations in urban warfare tactics that would prove invaluable in later conflicts. The combined arms coordination required to overcome prepared defensive positions in urban terrain demanded innovations in communications, engineering, and medical support that established new standards for military operations in built-up areas. The human cost of the expanding battle became increasingly apparent as November progressed. Field hospitals established in liberated French towns found themselves overwhelmed with casualties from the fortress fighting, many of whom required specialized treatment for wounds caused by fighting in confined spaces. Army medical personnel, accustomed to treating battlefield injuries, found themselves dealing with psychological trauma cases that existing medical doctrine had not anticipated or prepared them to handle. By mid-November, the Battle of Metz had consumed the equivalent of an entire division in casualties while advancing. American forces barely 3 miles toward their ultimate objective. The fortress city that German propaganda claimed could never be taken had become a grinding battle of attrition that tested American resolve and tactical flexibility in ways that the rapid advances of the previous months had not prepared them for. Every American soldier involved in the battle understood that they were writing a new chapter in military history, though the final outcome remained far from certain. The assault on Fort St. Private began at 0400 hours on November 21st, 1944, with the largest artillery barrage American forces had yet directed against a single objective in the European theater. 8 battalions of artillery, including the massive 8-inch howitzers of the 937th Field Artillery Battalion, pounded the fortress for 3 continuous hours, expending more ammunition in a single morning than some divisions had used during entire campaigns. Earlier in the war, Colonel John Hines, commanding officer of the 377th Infantry Regiment, watched from his forward observation post as shells ranging from 75mm to 8-inch high explosive crashed into the fortress with methodical precision. The bombardment was so intense that the ground shook continuously, and soldiers had to shout to be heard over the thunder of artillery fire. Yet when the barrage lifted and assault companies began their advance, Fort St. Private remained defiant, its concrete walls scarred but intact. The German garrison of Fort St. Private, commanded by Major Wilhelm Richter, had spent the artillery barrage in deep underground bunkers, specifically designed to protect defenders during preliminary bombardments. When American infantry began their assault, these defenders emerged from their shelters with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons that had been carefully positioned to dominate the approaches to the fortress. The resulting firefight was visible from observation, posts miles away, tracer rounds and explosions lighting up the pre-dawn darkness like a deadly fireworks display. Sergeant James Mitchell led his squad in what would become known as the longest dash, when they sprinted nearly 400 yards across open ground under intense enemy fire to reach the fortress walls. 3 of his men fell during the advance, but Mitchell and the survivors managed to reach a position where they could place demolition charges against what appeared to be a weak point in the fortress structure. The explosion that followed created a breach barely large enough for 1 man at a time to squeeze through, but it represented the first penetration of Fort St. Private's outer defenses. The fighting inside Fort St. Private proved even more savage than the battle for Fort Dryan had been. German defenders had learned from their earlier defeat, incorporating new defensive tactics that made every room a potential death trap. Booby traps using captured American grenades were hidden in abandoned equipment. Tripwires connected to explosive charges were strung across likely routes of advance, and sniper positions were established in locations that required American soldiers to expose themselves completely to eliminate the threat. Lieutenant David Clark from California found himself commanding a mixed group of soldiers from 3 different companies as they fought their way through the fortress interior. Combat had reduced formal military organization to meaningless abstractions. Soldiers fought in whatever groups they found themselves in, following whoever seemed to know what they were doing. Clark's command consisted of 2 sergeants, 6 privates, a medic, and a combat engineer, all from different units thrown together by the chaos of fortress warfare. The psychological breaking point came when German defenders began using American prisoners as human shields during counterattacks. Soldiers who had maintained their composure through weeks of brutal combat found themselves unable to fire on enemy positions that were protected by captured American soldiers. Medical corpsman Robert Hayes later described the impossible choices faced by American soldiers, who had to decide whether to risk hitting their own comrades or allow German positions to remain active and continue inflicting casualties on attacking forces. By November 24th, Fort St. Private had fallen, but the cost had been appalling even by the standards established. During the earlier fortress battles, the 377th Infantry Regiment had lost 60% of its effective strength, and many of the survivors were in no condition to continue combat operations. Medical evacuations had overwhelmed the capacity of field hospitals, and replacement soldiers arriving from training centers in the United States found themselves thrust immediately into combat conditions that no training could have prepared them for. The fall of Fort St. Private marked the beginning of the end for German resistance in Metz, but American commanders understood that several more fortress positions remained to be reduced before the city could be considered secure, and every one of them would exact a similar price in American lives. December 13th, 1944, dawned clear and cold as the final German defenders in the citadel of Metz prepared to surrender, ending one of the bloodiest urban warfare campaigns in American military history. Lieutenant General Walker stood in what had once been the mayor's office, now serving as his forward command post, watching through shattered windows as white flags appeared on the remaining German positions scattered throughout the ancient city. The surrender ceremony was brief and without ceremony. German Lieutenant General Heinrich Kittel, his uniform torn and blackened by weeks of underground fighting, emerged from the citadel accompanied by the surviving members of his staff. He, once proud fortress commander, now looked like what he was, a defeated soldier whose defensive masterpiece had finally been overcome by American determination and tactical innovation. The handover of the city was conducted with military professionalism, but there was no joy in the faces of the American soldiers who had paid such a terrible price. For this victory, Major General Irwin of the 5th Infantry Division read the casualty reports with a heavy heart. His Red Diamond Division had suffered over 3,000 casualties during the Battle of Metz, losses that represented nearly a complete turnover in personnel for many units. Companies that had entered the battle with full strength now consisted primarily of replacement soldiers who had arrived during the fighting, with only a handful of veterans remaining from the units that had crossed the Normandy beaches months earlier. The cost of victory extended far beyond mere numbers on casualty reports. Sergeant O'Malley, one of the few veterans who had survived the entire campaign, found himself unable to sleep in enclosed spaces, a condition that would plague him for the rest of his life. Captain Morrison, whose company had been reduced to just 11 effective soldiers by the battles, and would spend months in military hospitals recovering from wounds both physical and psychological. The Battle of Metz had changed every man who participated in it, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The strategic implications of the victory were significant, but came at a cost that raised serious questions about American tactical doctrine. General Patton's Third Army had spent nearly 3 months reducing a single city, consuming resources and manpower that could have been used for other objectives. Military analysts would later debate whether the fortress city could have been bypassed entirely, leaving it to be reduced by siege rather than costly direct assault. Yet the lessons learned at Metz would prove invaluable in future urban warfare operations. The innovations in combat engineering, medical treatment under fire, and small unit tactics developed during the fortress fighting would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The integration of armor, artillery, and infantry in urban environments, perfected at such cost during the Battle of Metz, would become standard practice for American forces facing similar challenges in future conflicts. The liberation of Metz was celebrated by French civilians, who had endured for years of German occupation, but their joy was tempered by the destruction that had engulfed their historic city. Ancient buildings that had stood for centuries lay in ruins, and unexploded ordnance scattered throughout the urban area would pose dangers to residents for years to come. The price of freedom had been paid not only by American soldiers, but by the French citizens, whose city had become a battlefield. As American forces prepared to continue their advance toward the German border, the soldiers who had survived the Battle of Metz carried with them hard-won knowledge about urban warfare that no training exercise could have provided. They understood that fortress fighting required different skills, different tactics, and different kinds of courage than mobile warfare. Most importantly, they had learned that even the strongest defensive positions could be overcome by American determination and tactical flexibility, though the cost would always be measured in the lives of brave soldiers who paid the ultimate price for victory. The Battle of Metz officially ended on December 13, 1944. But its impact on American military history would endure long after the last shots were fired. The fortress city that Hitler had declared impregnable had fallen, opening the path toward Germany itself. But the victory had been purchased with blood and sacrifice that would never be forgotten by those who fought in the ancient streets and underground chambers of this historic French city.